There is something quietly happening in the world right now. Something subtle enough that most people will never name it, yet powerful enough to reshape entire lives from the inside out. The most psychologically aware individuals are not rising louder, not becoming more visible, not fighting harder to be seen. They are withdrawing, not dramatically, not with anger, not with explanation. They are simply stepping back, as if something within them has reached a limit that can no longer be negotiated. If you have been feeling this pull, this quiet urge to step away from noise, from endless interaction, from the constant demand to perform and engage, then what you're experiencing is not confusion, and it is not weakness. It is the psyche recognizing something that the conscious mind is only beginning to understand. Carl Jung described this as a necessary withdrawal, a movement that occurs when awareness deepens to a point where remaining immersed in collective unconscious patterns becomes not just uncomfortable, but genuinely painful. At a certain level of consciousness, participation in ordinary social dynamics begins to feel like a kind of internal contradiction. You start noticing things you did not see before, not just behaviors, but the underlying currents beneath them. You begin to see projection where others see certainty, shadow where others see righteousness, unconscious repetition where others believe they are making independent choices. And once this perception stabilizes, it does not go away. It becomes the new baseline of how you experience reality. This is where the separation begins, not because you want to disconnect, but because staying fully engaged requires you to ignore what you now clearly see. Every conversation starts to carry a second layer. Every interaction reveals something unspoken. And over time, the effort required to pretend that you do not notice these deeper dynamics becomes exhausting in a way that rest cannot fix. Jung himself experienced this. As his understanding of the psyche expanded, ordinary social life became increasingly difficult to tolerate, not out of superiority, but out of incompatibility. He described a kind of isolation that does not come from being alone, but from perceiving reality differently than those around you. It is like being awake in a room where everyone else is still dreaming, and every interaction requires you to speak a language that no longer feels true. This is the beginning of what he called the burden of consciousness. Because awareness is not only a gift, it is also a responsibility. Once you see, you cannot return to not seeing. Once you understand, you cannot genuinely participate in what contradicts that understanding without feeling a subtle form of self-betrayal. And this is why the withdrawal happens, not as rejection of others, but as preservation of something within yourself that has taken immense effort to develop. Because remaining fully immersed in unconscious environments requires you to dim that awareness, to reduce your perception, to compress your understanding into forms that are socially acceptable but internally false. Over time, the psyche resists this. It begins to pull back, much like a hand instinctively retracts from heat. Not because the world is hostile in an obvious way, but because it becomes energetically incompatible with your current level of awareness. One of the most difficult aspects of this shift is what happens when you begin integrating your own shadow. Jung emphasized that real psychological growth requires confronting the parts of yourself you would rather not see. Your capacity for anger, for manipulation, for fear, for contradiction. When you genuinely face these aspects, something changes in how you perceive others. You start recognizing that what most people are reacting to externally is often something unresolved internally. What looks like conflict becomes projection. What looks like certainty becomes defense. What looks like moral clarity often reveals itself as unconscious, material-seeking expression. And once you see this clearly, participating in collective conflict becomes almost impossible. You cannot fully take sides when you understand that both sides may be projecting. You cannot fully engage in outrage when you see it as displaced inner tension. You cannot join movements driven by blame when you recognize the mechanism beneath them. And this creates a strange position. You are no longer aligned with the collective emotional current, but you are still physically present within it. This is what Jung referred to as the burden of seeing. It is not a comfortable position. It is not a detached superiority. It is a kind of heightened sensitivity that makes unconscious dynamics feel heavier, louder, more intrusive. And over time, the body itself begins to respond to this, because this is not just intellectual. It becomes physiological. Your nervous system starts reacting to environments that are saturated with unprocessed emotional material. You may feel drained after interactions that used to feel neutral. You may notice a subtle tension in crowded spaces or a sense of overwhelm in environments where unconscious projection is constant. Jung observed that as consciousness develops, sensitivity increases, not in a fragile way, but in a precise way. You begin to register things that were always present, but previously unnoticed. And once this sensitivity emerges, exposure to certain environments can feel less like discomfort and more like ongoing psychological strain. This is one of the reasons why many people who undergo deep psychological development begin to withdraw from social media first, because social media amplifies unconscious dynamics at a scale and intensity that has never existed before. It compresses projection, comparison, outrage, validation seeking, and identity performance into a continuous stream that the psyche must process. For someone who has not examined these dynamics, this environment feels normal. For someone who has, it can feel overwhelming, not because of specific content, but because of the constant exposure to unintegrated psychological material being expressed without awareness. Another shift that begins to occur is related to the persona. Jung described the persona as the social mask, the version of ourselves we present in order to function within society. Before psychological awakening, this mask feels natural. It allows us to move through different roles without much resistance. But once you begin connecting with your authentic self, the persona becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. It starts to feel artificial, not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle, persistent way. You notice when you're saying things you do not fully mean. You feel the gap between what you express and what you actually experience. And over time, that gap becomes harder to tolerate, because the more aligned you become internally, the more uncomfortable it feels to present something that is not aligned externally. What once felt like normal social behavior begins to feel like a form of self-distortion. This creates another layer of withdrawal, not because you reject connection, but because you can no longer sustain interactions that require you to be something other than what you are. The roles that once defined you begin to dissolve. The expectations that once guided you begin to lose their hold. And this can be deeply disorienting because as these structures fall away, there is often a period where nothing immediately replaces them. You are no longer fully identified with your previous identity, but you have not yet stabilized into a new one. Jung referred to this as a necessary phase in the individuation process. Individuation is the movement toward becoming your authentic self, not the self shaped entirely by external expectations. And this process almost always includes a phase of separation, a period where you step back from familiar environments in order to understand yourself without constant external influence. This is not isolation for its own sake. It is not avoidance. It is a restructuring, a reorganization of identity that requires space, silence, and time. Because the deeper aspects of the psyche do not emerge in noise. They require a different kind of attention. Jung often withdrew to his tower in Bollingen for this reason, not to escape the world, but to create the conditions necessary for deeper psychological work. He understood that transformation cannot fully occur while constantly adapting to external demands. There must be moments where the psyche is allowed to unfold without interruption. And this is what many people are unconsciously moving toward now. A kind of modern hermit phase, not necessarily complete isolation, but a deliberate reduction of unnecessary engagement. A shift toward environments that support authenticity rather than performance. This phase is often misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like disengagement, like withdrawal, like loss of ambition. But internally, something else is happening. The individual is reorganizing their relationship to themselves, to others, and to the collective. They are learning to exist without constant external validation. They are learning to listen to their own inner signals rather than the expectations around them. They are learning to differentiate between what is truly theirs and what has been absorbed from the environment. And this process requires energy, a significant amount of it, which is why remaining in environments that continuously drain that energy becomes unsustainable. Jung observed that many individuals in this phase experience fatigue, not because something is wrong, but because they are expending enormous psychological effort, navigating incompatible environments. When they step away from those environments, something shifts. Energy returns. Clarity increases. Not because they're doing less, but because they are no longer using their awareness to constantly filter and manage unconscious input from others. This is the deeper reason behind the withdrawal. It is not about rejecting life. It is about preserving the capacity to experience it authentically. It is about recognizing that consciousness itself is a resource, and that it cannot be endlessly spent in environments that do not support it. And so the withdrawal continues quietly, without announcement, without explanation. Not as an ending, but as a transition into something that cannot fully emerge until the noise subsides and the individual is able to hear, perhaps for the first time, the unfiltered voice of their own psyche. What is important to understand is that this withdrawal is not meant to be permanent. Jung was very clear about this. The movement away from society is not the final destination. It is a phase A necessary phase, one that allows something deeper to take form before it is brought back into relationship with the world. Because the truth is, the awakened individual does not lose their connection to humanity. If anything, that connection becomes more refined, more honest, less dependent on illusion. But in order for that to happen, there must first be a separation from the structures that distort that connection. This is why the hermit archetype appears across cultures, across myths, across psychological traditions. It represents a phase of descent, of turning inward, of stepping away from the known in order to encounter something more fundamental. It is the part of the journey where the individual stops seeking answers externally and begins listening internally. And this listening changes everything. Because when the external noise quiets, something else becomes audible, a different kind of guidance. Not loud, not forceful, but consistent. It does not argue. It does not demand. It reveals itself gradually, as if waiting for the individual to become still enough to notice it. Jung believed that this inner voice is not something we create. It is something we uncover. It has always been there, beneath layers of conditioning, expectation, and adaptation. But it can only emerge when those layers begin to loosen. This is why solitude becomes not just desirable, but necessary. Not loneliness, but intentional solitude. A space where you are not constantly reacting, not constantly adjusting, not constantly interpreting yourself through the lens of others. A space where you can observe your own thoughts, your own patterns, your own internal contradictions without interference. Because this is where real integration happens. Not in conversation, not in performance, not in external validation, but in quiet confrontation with yourself. This is where the shadow continues to unfold, where unconscious material rises into awareness, where contradictions begin to resolve into something more coherent. And this process cannot be rushed. It follows its own rhythm. There are moments of clarity, followed by confusion, followed by deeper clarity. There are periods of stillness, followed by unexpected emotional movement. There are insights that feel complete, only to be expanded later into something more complex. This is the nature of psychological transformation. It is not linear, it is not predictable, and it does not conform to social timelines. This is also why many people misunderstand those who are going through this process. From the outside, it can look like disengagement, like loss of direction, like withdrawal from life. But internally, something much more precise is happening. The individual is reorganizing their entire internal structure. They are renegotiating their relationship with identity, with meaning, with purpose. They are letting go of roles that no longer fit, even if those roles once brought them validation, success, or belonging. And this can look like loss. Careers are left behind. Relationships shift or dissolve. Social circles become smaller. But what is actually happening is not loss in the traditional sense. It is refinement, a movement toward alignment that cannot occur without letting go of what is misaligned. Jung observed that individuals who fully engage in this process rarely return to their previous lives in the same way, not because they cannot, but because they no longer resonate with them. The structures that once held meaning now feel incomplete, insufficient, or disconnected from what they have come to understand. Instead, they begin to build something new, often simpler, often quieter, but also more authentic, more sustainable, more aligned with who they have become rather than who they were expected to be. And when they do return to engagement with the world, it is different. They are no longer participating unconsciously. They are not driven by the same need for approval, for recognition, for belonging at any cost. Their participation becomes more intentional, more selective. They may contribute through creative work, through teaching, through healing, through quiet forms of influence that do not rely on visibility or status. They may engage with smaller communities rather than large systems. They may prioritize depth over reach, authenticity over scale. But what defines their return is not what they do. It is how they do it. There is a different quality to their presence, a steadiness, a clarity, a lack of internal contradiction that can be felt even if it is not fully understood. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about individuation serving not only the individual, but the collective. Because a fully individuated person brings something rare into the world, not perfection, not certainty, but integration, a psyche that is not divided against itself. And this has an effect, even if it is subtle, even if it is not immediately recognized, because most people are navigating life from a place of internal fragmentation. Different parts of themselves in conflict, different identities competing, different unconscious patterns shaping their behavior. When they encounter someone who has moved toward integration, something registers, even if they cannot name it. Even if they do not fully understand it, there is a sense of coherence, of groundedness, of presence that does not require explanation. But this kind of presence can only develop through the very withdrawal that often feels confusing or even uncomfortable at the beginning. It requires stepping away from the constant reinforcement of external identity. It requires facing the uncertainty of not knowing exactly who you are becoming. And this is where many people struggle, because the in-between phase is not easy. It is not clearly defined. There are no clear markers of progress. There is no external validation confirming that you're moving in the right direction. There is only an internal sense, a quiet knowing that something is changing, even if you cannot fully articulate what it is. A subtle shift in what feels right and what no longer does. A growing inability to return to previous patterns, even when they were once comfortable. And this is where trust becomes essential. Not blind trust, but experiential trust. Trust built from noticing that when you follow this internal movement, even when it leads to uncertainty, something within you becomes more stable, not less. Jung would say that this is the self emerging, not the ego, not the persona, but a deeper organizing center of the psyche. One that does not operate based on external expectations, but on internal coherence. And as this center becomes more established, the need to withdraw begins to change. It is no longer about escaping environments, but about choosing them consciously. It is no longer about avoiding interaction, but about engaging without losing yourself. This is the shift from reactive withdrawal to intentional presence, from needing distance to maintain clarity, to being able to remain clear even in proximity to others. But this shift only happens after the earlier phase has been allowed to complete itself. If it is rushed, if the individual returns too quickly to environments that demand adaptation, the process can become fragmented. The old patterns can reassert themselves. The persona can rebuild itself around the emerging self. creating a new layer of subtle inauthenticity. This is why the timing matters, not in a rigid sense, but in a psychological sense. The process must be allowed to unfold fully enough that what emerges is stable, not provisional. And this brings us to something essential. The withdrawal you may be experiencing is not a failure of connection. It is a redefinition of it. It is the psyche reorganizing how it relates to the world, not disconnecting from it entirely. You're not becoming less human. You're becoming more precise in how you express your humanity, less driven by unconscious patterns, more guided by conscious awareness, less reactive, more intentional. And while this may reduce the number of interactions you have, it increases the quality of the ones that remain, because they are no longer based on roles or expectations, but on genuine resonance. Jung understood that the collective does not immediately recognize or support this process. In fact, it often resists it, because individuation challenges the very structures that maintain collective identity. It introduces difference, complexity, and ambiguity where uniformity is more comfortable. But despite this resistance, the process continues quietly, individually, one person at a time, each moving through their own version of this withdrawal, this integration, this return. And if you are in this phase right now, what you are experiencing is not random. It is not something to pathologize or dismiss. It is a movement that has been described, observed, and lived by those who have gone through deep psychological transformation before you. You are not withdrawing because you have nothing to offer the world. You are withdrawing because what you have to offer is still forming. It is still integrating. It is still becoming something that cannot yet be expressed within the structures you previously inhabited. And when it is ready, when it has taken shape, when it is no longer fragile or dependent on specific conditions, it will find its way back into the world. Not necessarily in the way you expect, but in a way that reflects who you have actually become. Until then, the most important thing is not to force yourself back into alignment with what no longer fits. It is to allow this phase to unfold with as much honesty as possible, to recognize that the discomfort you may feel is not a sign that something is wrong, but that something real is happening. Jung might say it this way: the path to becoming yourself is not a path of constant connection. It is a path that moves through periods of necessary solitude, not as an escape from life, but as a preparation for a deeper participation in it. And if you can hold that understanding, even when the process feels uncertain, then what looks like disappearance from the outside begins to reveal itself for what it truly is. Not a retreat, but a transformation in progress.